part of the problem, frankly, with blue is that everything in their ideology and their behavior and their doctrine is all about power. And that has seriously undercut them in terms of their capacity to connect with the American people.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I am Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It's a modest fall in Londinium by the Thames. The centurions retired and their families have gone on home. And we're speculating not only on our own century, the first century AD, and the surprising changes ahead in the second century. This is Rome, might of Rome. We have 1,500 years to account for. We're still watching the 21st century because it's entertaining. And we see echoes of our own time. We apply what we know of our history to the American Empire, which is an inheritor of the might of Rome most of the time. Right now, we're watching the events of the closing days of someone like Tiberius, an aged politician who was once extremely successful, remaining in power in Washington for 50 years, but is now in the twilight. And yet, he's got a punch. And so Germanicus is here to observe what appears to be imperial sabotage directed at his own supporters, not his successor, his supporters. Germanicus, I note that it is not clear at all how it is that Tiberius chose to step aside from running for re-election to empire. We don't have the details. We know that he made an announcement and said he would be stepping aside. And then some hours later, there was a second announcement endorsing Vice President Harris. We don't know what happened that day. We do know that there is talk that the idea driven by Nancy Pelosi and others, leaders in the party, was that Mr. Biden would step aside, Tiberius would step away, the good of the empire. And there would be a quick and extremely successful primary process, and emerging would be the governor of California. That was a plan, maybe the plan. It didn't happen with that second announcement. Now, that's the first instance now where it's possible we're watching sabotage. You've seen some other elements most recently. What gain is there for Tiberius to sabotage his own side?
Spite, pure spite. And this has been a feature of politics in every society and in every civilization. And if you have the kind of ego that Mr. Biden has, and I know because I spent an hour with Mr. Biden in the early 80s on the Larry King show, and I got some measure of the man. And he is one of the most intensely ambitious and obdurate to his own limitations, let's put it that way. He is someone the likes of which I've never met. As Clint Eastwood said in a Dirty Harry movie, a man's got to know his limitations. Biden has never really confronted his limitations because they frighten him. And as a result, he is unchained, like Prometheus. He's liberated now. Once it was all over, to wreak his vengeance on the party that had promised him so much, that had dealt him so many bad hands and manipulated him. And the frustration is intense. I mean, for him to have been told in 2008 by his president, Joe, this isn't your time, this isn't for you, you've got to bow out. And he kept he is relentless and dogged, and to be finally garroted at the end the way he was, he took as a stab in the back. And so he responds like Caesar. Had Caesar not been killed in the Roman Senate, and so he is taking his vengeance, and he's doing things that will sink his party. He started doing that during the campaign. I mean, he made several really powerful moves that helped to subvert Ms. Harris's campaign, and now he has continued to do that. And it it is a kind of piece of the theater and of the great story that we understand from our own times, reading, say, Suetonius in the lives of the 12 Caesars. There have been so many situations where a candidate spurned for the Senate, for the imperial office, will take their revenge, will respond in ways that may bring down the whole edifice, but they don't care because they're pissed off.
I note one incident struck me as strange. Welcoming the president-elect to the Oval Office. Welcome back. With warmth and generosity, a handshake, exchanging comments to each other about how we'll make it a smooth transition. This within days of having observed his party declare the president-elect, well, they called names routinely. We can all remember them, but
Yeah.
they were not the sort of names that are associated with one bad act. They were the sort of names associated with tyranny.
Yeah.
Is welcoming to the Oval Office. This was inadvertent that he's saying to his own people, you you have it wrong. He's a warm grandfatherly figure, or he's saying to his own side, you were wrong. He's not a fascist. What was he doing?
Deep daggers or stilettos is what that represents, right out of the world of Machiavelli and the Italian Renaissance. I remember back in the early 80s, some time ago, when one of my Yale classmates, a great friend, came up to me and said, Mike, you're my favorite fascist. Because, I was a big Reagan supporter. And then, it never meant anything to him since. It's like it was nothing. It was, what was that? And I think it's the same thing with the Democrats. They would tar their opponents as fascists just to gain some smidge of electoral advantage in the moment. And it's so pathetic because, there's some places you can't go without an abridgment of social relations. And that's a bad sign. It's a bad sign that they think that, oh, we can just, it isn't like let bygones be bygones. It's more like, oh, that never happened. Oh, hey, it's just politics. And well, it isn't. Ultimately, it is a kind of window, a kind of suddenly opening aperture, not simply to their tone deafness and their dissimulation and their moral weakness, but also it is a sign that they're craven when they lose that badly and they know they lost badly because of things they did or didn't do that were very obvious, but they couldn't see at the time. And when they're faced with this calamity of their own making, their response is, "Oh, it didn't happen." It's the kind of weak response and frightened response that you get from someone who's done a bad thing and doesn't want to own up to it and wants to try and find a way to socially claw back into the good graces of whatever establishment there is and act as though nothing happened. And this is bad for blue in the sense that everyone can see it, everyone remembers, and the only one who looks good is Mr. Trump because he's gracious. He acts as though, hey, Uh, I can take it. All right. I'm not going to remind you of your craven behavior, your vituperation, your overturning of all political norms. No, I'm fine. And so it really is an indication of a party that is heading into a kind of very dark place for itself, wherein it will have to come to terms. At some point, it will have to come to terms. That hasn't happened yet.
Mr. Trump said, Mr. Biden, and I paraphrase, politics is not nice. It's really not nice. I think he was referring to the name calling.
Right.
We're going to turn to Mr. Biden's decision making in these last weeks with regard to Ukraine. We go over endlessly the Teutoburg Forest. It is the defeat of defeats meant to instruct all emperors and all generals and everyone who aspires to be either about limits, about humility, about not taking your enemy for granted, especially your enemy when he's on your team and commands the auxiliary cavalry. Teutoburg Forest happened under Augustus, 8 to 11, about 8 AD, our calendar. And it was a massacre of 3 Roman legions. A man named Varus led it. He committed suicide. Everybody died. The Germans made it very clear, you will not cross into Germania. That's the limits of your expansion. This is Augustus's time. What is that lesson for the American empire, especially when it comes to Ukraine? How do you see it, Germanicus?
I see it as a powerful lesson. I see it as a powerful lesson on 3 levels. First level is Roman expansion. Rome, after the triumph of Gaius Julius Caesar in Gaul and his celebration of that in his own memoirs, a political tract more powerful even than Mein Kampf, which was the De Bello Gallico, which catapulted him into dominance in Rome. That became like a model for Romans, a lightning rod for Romans who wanted immediately and forever to live up to his model, just as Greeks and Romans wanted to live up to the deeds of Alexander. And so what you see with Rome in the generation after Augustus, I mean, after Caesar, and the civil wars, once Augustus was ensconced, the expansion eastward continued. In fact, Rome's expansion into Germany very much mirrors NATO expansion. Why did NATO expand? Well, there was never a good reason. It was just necessary. It was part of the destiny, part of the inheritance, the obligation, and the expectation from the gods of what Rome must be. And Augustus sent his generals in. They were his adopted son Tiberius, uh, and Tiberius's son Drusus, who performed magnificently and then died of a equestrian accident, and then ultimately Germanicus, who was the son of Tiberius, and you have effectively, I mean, the son of, I can't remember now, he was the grandson of Tiberius, I guess.
Yes.
And what you have is a continuing expansion into Germany without reference to the various peoples who lived there. And some of them folded and became good Romans. Others, like the Cherusci, did not. And they fought and fought and fought. And then eventually they sort of accommodated, but they were scheming the whole time. And the Romans were lured into a trap and they went too far. You could use this as an allegory to NATO going too far in Ukraine. And what happened was this magnificent defeat of Roman arms, which the Romans had not experienced since the destruction of Crassus' army at Carrhae, um, 60 years earlier. And it is a bit like what we're going to have to deal with in a few months in Ukraine. And what the Roman response was reflexive. It kept on invading. And in fact, if you look at a map in the period several years after the Teutoburg revolt, say the year 12 AD, the Romans are still maintaining a lot of the territories that they had brought under their control. And what is interesting is that although Rome eventually, and this was a decision of Tiberius, eventually said, no, we're not going to try and bring the Germans to heel, inevitably the Romans did incorporate a large part of Germany under their control in Bavaria and what are now Baden and Württemberg and the Rhineland. Those are significant parts of Germany, and they were all German. And so, in effect, what the Romans did is they created a kind of a formal frontier, incorporated a lot of the Germans into Rome, and then the Germans on the other side, increasingly over the next several centuries, became indistinguishable from Romans. So the Romans didn't lose anything. But here's the point. What Augustus did and what Tiberius followed up with was to say, we're going to stop expanding. And yet, by stopping the formal expansion of empire, they did not stop the cultural and economic expansion of Rome into Germany. In effect, not trying to bring the Germans to heel was better ultimately for Rome than trying to crush people who didn't want to be servants of Rome. And this is the possibility, I think, that Mr. Trump offers, in the sense that the U.S. does not spread democracy by bringing people to heel and fighting people forever. The U.S. has always been successful by being a model and by, at some point, saying, okay, if you want to be with us, you're with us. They're NATO, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, whatever. That's great. But others, here we are. We're not going to try and do anything to you. And unfortunately, that has not been the U.S. position, policy, or practical behavior for the last 40 years. And as a result, we've become roundly hated in what is now called, awkwardly, the Global South. Just as awkward a term as Third World was before it. But the fact is that the U.S. would do better by standing down than by continuing to confront and fight.
We're told Mr. Trump intends to stand down. In the meantime, Mr. Biden, again, maybe an element of sabotage here.
Yes.
We're told in the headlines that he's approved long-range strike missiles, which heretofore had been forbidden. You don't know why now. Possibly sabotage, possibly they have more negotiating room. I'm not going to speculate. We'll get it all in the papers. We're also told that Mr. Putin has access to up to 100,000 North Korean soldiers. It's a headline in London. So we're looking at game playing. We can presume it's the background of negotiation. However, your warning and the warning of the Teutoburg Forest is
Yes.
don't try it. Don't don't push any farther. And the Ukrainians have done exactly that. The
We're
first,
on,
the first
yeah,
sailing is an example of not knowing your limits.
we are on the cusp of a defeat comparable to that of Rome with Varus in 980. And we can't face up to what's staring us in the face right now, but we should. And I think that Mr. Biden's decision to continue to what's the right term? Tickle the nose of the lion or whatever, is a mistake because one thing we know from this entire war is that the leader with the greatest forbearance has been Mr. Putin. And knowing that Mr. Trump will be president in, what, 60 days, he's not going to escalate. In other words, the Democrats are going to cover themselves in yet greater shame, which will hurt them in the future for having advanced such um, flagrantly provocative actions to subvert the next president. And it will only, if done adroitly, that is, by Mr. Trump's advisors, play into the hands of the new administration. And I can only see this actually helping Mr. Trump because of it will expose the desperate and destructive situation that Ukraine is in right now, because as it implodes, for it to be able to lash out, and for an American president, which is to say Mr. Biden, sanctioning it to lash out is a terrible presentation. What we need now is to preserve what's left of Ukraine and rebuild it as a neutral country and to end the war. And I think Mr. Biden's action will only further empower Mr. Trump if his advisors have the skill to make this happen.
Right now, we have Elon Musk in an Occupy Mars t-shirt at Mar-a-Lago, making decisions not only about how he's going to reduce the size of government, something called Doge, but also who he favors for various ministries and opinions. Good. Germanicus, I studied that t-shirt, Occupy Mars. This is an ambitious Roman general, very ambitious, and that's a good thing. I don't know who he is. I don't know whether there's something comparable in our time. He's not Vespasian. He doesn't want to be emperor, but he has the authority of the emperor, Mr. Trump. I'd like to say this is going to end well. However, I hesitate. You hesitate. We have a few minutes.
In Rome, at its height, when you had a well institutionalized and stable imperial office, and the accession to that office and the replacement of one emperor by another, a succession process that was also well established. Um, Emperors were able to designate very powerful sort of right hands. If you look at Game of Thrones, the hand of the king, for example, and that's a kind of relationship that you would see even with Augustus. So Augustus had who? You know, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, and Agrippa was the hand of Augustus. He performed what no other person could for Augustus, and he was trusted. He did not want to usurp his best friend, his bosom comrade. Now, the same was true in other times in Rome. Most celebrated was the relationship of the Emperor Justinian with his great general Belisarius. And Belisarius, according to Robert Graves and his wonderful novel Count Belisarius, there was an equally strong relationship between Belisarius's wife, Antonina, and Justinian's celebrated wife, Theodora. And so there was a special bond between Justinian and Belisarius, but Belisarius essentially presided over the complete renovatio or restoration of the Roman Empire. And he never wanted to be emperor. And this is something that we can almost discern here today. And I think it's a good sign for Mr. Trump. A true narcissist would never bring people like Mr. Trump onto the stage with them and give them so much reign. The same with RFK Jr. or Tulsi Gabbard. I think you have a remarkable situation where an emperor like Augustus is so strongly placed in the firmament of political legitimacy.
I said, wait just a moment now. You,
Yes, that he is able that
that
he is able to designate very strong people to do very great things. I think that's remarkable.
Occupy Mars is the richest man in the solar system. That's another kind of general than Kennedy or Gabbard. Another kind. I just mentioned nothing has gone wrong. However, we're
Mm.
told that the legend is that after the shooting in Butler, Pennsylvania, Mr. Musk, the richest man in the universe, who deals both with China and the United States and Europe simultaneously, decided to support Mr. Trump.
Yes, a sign from heaven, of course.
Yes, responding to his internal visions, which is good. However, there can be problems. That's all. I'm not saying there are now. I'm just mentioning.
But let's make a contrast here. I mean, if I might for just a second, I mean, the Democrats have plenty of richest men on earth. They had Jeff Bezos, they
No,
had
this is the richest man in the solar
no,
system.
no, 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 no. But they had very Soros. You have Bloomberg. There were a slew of billionaires supporting the Democrats, but they were your standard barons and dukes of money, and they gave huge amounts of money, and they pursued through their foundations all sorts of um, kindred projects.
You're not answering my concern.
Well, what is your concern then?
This is an extraordinarily powerful person outside of the reach of the Oval Office, and yet is speaking to the Oval Office routinely.
Yes, and I think that is an alliance, as I mentioned, that will be fruitful. Now, the question is whether or not it will be maintained. I mean, throughout the Roman Empire and deep into the period we call Byzantium, which is really still Roman, when generals got too strong, typically the expectation would be that they would rebel, there'd be a civil war, and they would push to be emperor themselves. However, what you have just outlined in terms of Mr. Musk's, coming to Jesus moment after the assassination attempt is that he sees something bigger in Mr. Trump, and therefore you have a deeper bond that is not predicated on venal power issues. And part of the problem, frankly, with blue is that everything in their ideology and their behavior and their doctrine is all about power. And that has seriously undercut them in terms of their capacity to connect with the American people. And what Mr. Trump has done has been to connect at a very different level. And it seems as though the level at which regular people have connected to Trump is the same level with the same authenticity and the same passion that Mr. Musk has connected with.
All right. I will. I'll take your advice.
No, I'm just saying, that's what I see. That's my observation.
It's where we are. I don't see any differently right now. What I'm doing is rehearsing history.
Right, of course.
Germanicus, Gaius. We're off to see scenes from the frogs. Aristophanes. It's supposed to be a comedy. Now, if you think the Greeks can write comedy, gee. But in any event, there is an opening scene that's funny because they're going to Hades, hell. And the servant's carrying a lot of baggage. It's the scene I enjoy. This is the Friends of History Debating Society in Londinium. It's a little chilly. We'll rush along to sacrifice to Augustus, who knew his limits. Didn't give long-range strike missiles on the eve of a defeat to his generals. And bumpy ride, fasten seatbelts. I'm John Batchelor.